We'll start in like 1 minute. All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to an afternoon with Brian McLaren. Yes, yes. I absolutely share your enthusiasm. So glad that you are here. I am not Brian McLaren, although I can understand why it could be confusing. My name is Sam Yoon. I'm the pastor here at San Ramon Valley United Methodist Church, where our vision is to pursue a life with God and a life with each other by following Jesus, thriving in community, and healing the world. That last part is so much of our motivation for putting on this event, not just for this church, but for our whole community. And so, indeed, it is truly a joy to welcome you here today as we gather for what promises to be an inspiring and thought-provoking conversation. And we are honored to have with us Brian McLaren, an author, speaker, activist, scholar, theologian, modern prophet. I could go on and on. There's so many other things. And I would say one of the most influential voices in contemporary Christianity. Brian has spent decades helping people navigate faith in a rapidly changing world, and I think a lot of you know that already. He is the author of more than 20 books. I don't know, what is the count right now? He's lost count. One of our members told him earlier this morning that he had to take out a second mortgage in order to buy all of his books that were out there. Some of his books, including A New Kind of Christian, A Generous Orthodoxy, Faith After Doubt, and a brand new sci-fi book to be released in July called The Last Voyage. Get ready, that's going to be a good one. And of course, the book that launches our conversation today, Life After Doom. Did you bring your copy? Oh yeah, there's going to be, your hand is going to be very tired today, Brian, when you're signing this. His work challenges us to wrestle with difficult questions, embrace a faith that is both just and generous, and imagine new ways of living with purpose, hope, and love. Brian is a former pastor. He has a passion for spirituality, social justice, and global transformation that has led him to speak all over the world, equipping individuals and communities like us to engage deeply with their faith in a way, and this is the point, that leads to some sort of action, right? So this afternoon we come together in a time when uncertainty and fear and division often dominate our headlines and our hearts. But Brian's latest book, Life After Doom, invites us to look beyond despair, to seek new possibilities, fresh imagination, and a renewed sense of purpose. So thank you all for being here. Thank you for showing up for a conversation that absolutely matters. And now it is my great privilege and honor to introduce Brian McLaren.
What an honor to be introduced by. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
There we go. Yes? No? So maybe I broke it. I've been known to do that sort of thing before. Let's see. I'm going to turn it off and on again. That sometimes helps me. Does that work? No? Maybe someone can hand me another microphone. We could turn it on. So we just switched. Let's see if this works. Test check. Hey, that works. Great. Fantastic.
It's my honor to introduce Brian McLaren.
So, yeah, it is. I'm impressed. I'm honored that you all would spend a Sunday afternoon, especially such a beautiful one. It shows what you care about. I want to say, wherever you're coming from, you are so welcome here. Obviously, this is held in a Methodist church, and there are some members from this church. We thank you for welcoming us here, people from maybe other churches and faith communities, different religious backgrounds. Some of us maybe who would consider ourselves secular or spiritual but not religious. Wherever you're coming from is fine. I think we have a number of people from the environmental community who would come because you're committed to this issue and you're happy to be around some other neighbors who are. You're so welcome here, because what we'll be talking about for the next 40 minutes or so is not bound up in what divides us or what makes us different or sometimes even oppositional. What we're here to talk about is what binds us all together. We are all children of the earth. Those of you with a religious background, in the book of Genesis, you know when the name of the first human is given, Adam. Adam means child of red earth. And so this fundamental identity that we have as earth people is what brings us together today. I wondered if I could begin just with a little, I call this 15 breaths, little quiet, reflective time to kind of center ourselves and realize we're here. First, I'm going to invite us to take 5 deep breaths. And as you breathe in, I'd like you to be aware that the oxygen that you're breathing, half of the oxygen you're breathing in, came from trees. So as you breathe in, be aware the trees are giving you artificial respiration. It's natural respiration they're giving you. And then as you breathe out, you're breathing out carbon dioxide, which trees like they need. So just all of us together, just if you want to close your eyes, you can. If you want to look out at the window at the trees, you can. 5 breaths together. Five more breaths. This time, about half of the oxygen that you need in the world comes from plankton in the ocean. And so I'd like you to think of the seas and the oceans of the world and realize that your existence, every breath, is connected to the beautiful oceans of this amazing blue planet. 5 breaths. and 5 more breaths. One of the reasons we're breathing in air and we need oxygen is because just as with a fire, you need oxygen for combustion. And one of the reasons you're breathing in air is because you need to digest food to be your fuel. And so as we take these 5 breaths, realize we're breathing in oxygen to assist with our combustion or our digestion of food, which is dependent on soil. So let's think in these 5 breaths, breathing in, realizing we receive gifts with every breath from the soil, and breathing out to realize that in some sense makes us need to love and appreciate and care for the soil just as we do the oceans, just as we do the trees. I'd like to begin by first mentioning this book. When you put something I learned in writing this book, when you put the word doom in the title, it's the only thing people remember. They didn't notice that it actually was life after doom. Doom is a very, very strong word. I define doom not as the end of your existence. I define doom as a psychological experience that many of us never experienced in our lives until recently. Some of us maybe haven't begun to experience it even today, but it's the experience you feel when you see that our problems have grown bigger than our solutions. I think I always believed that our solutions were bigger than our problems. So every problem that came along just meant, I just need to find the solution. There was a ready-made existing solution. But when you have a feeling, and this hits us in some ways. Some of us have been through a divorce. You were married and you thought you can work your problems out. And then you might remember the exact moment, the exact argument when you said, I think our problems are bigger than our solutions. Or some of you, you've had that phone call, or you've gone to the doctor and you got that biopsy result, and you had never really faced the possibility that you might not make it. And some of us maybe are living with that reality. You've processed in your nervous system a diagnosis that you never had to think about until recently. But here's the thing that I believe is in the process of happening to 8+ billion human beings, that our species is recognizing thousands every day, maybe hundreds of thousands every day. People are having this experience. It's in their nervous system of saying, we're in deep trouble, and I'm not sure we can fix it. I'm going to guess that some of you have felt that since the election. You've felt that in a way you never felt it before since the election. I wouldn't presume that all of us have the same politics in this room. I think there are many people for whom the last 5 weeks have been the happiest weeks of their lives. They're so thrilled with what's being done. Problems are being addressed and solved. They've never felt this happy and confident before. Others of us would feel we've never been this nervous before. We've never felt we're in this much trouble before. So, this is a real deal. And I put the word doom in the title on purpose. I'll just tell you one other thing before we jump in. The reaction to the book came out last May. It's bizarre how consistent it has been. A cutoff at, I think, around age 50 to 55, might be down to 45. People older than this age have had one response to the book, and younger have had another. I'm telling this for all the older people, you're going to be surprised. The most common response of younger people to the book, I can't tell you how consistent this has been, is the word relief. that when they read the book, they felt, finally somebody is talking about what I wake up thinking about every day. Now, there are a few older people who've said this, but by far, almost every younger person who's read the book that's the word they've used with me. And the word I hear from older people is hard. It was hard to read, especially chapter 2. But I'd like to begin by telling you a story about my Grandpa Smith, my mother's father. He was kind of my favorite adult after my parents. And he had an 8th grade education, was born in upstate New York, died in upstate New York, Rochester, New York. His great-grandfather was a vegetable huckster, drove from one part of town to another in a horse-drawn carriage, shouting out the names of the vegetables and fruits he had for sale that day. He would say them in English and in Italian and in Polish, because those are the 3 major neighborhoods where he sold vegetables. His father picked up that business. My grandfather grew up, do you say driving the horses? Whatever, holding the reins, and he learned how to shout out all the names. I remember him doing that when I was a boy. I just revered him. I loved him. We lived in upstate New York. I should say, one of my favorite things about him is he had false teeth, like full set of dentures, like in the old comic books, and he would take out his dentures and just do things that could make a boy giggle like nothing else you've ever seen. And my grandmother would always go, "Oh, Steve," when he did this. Because we lived in upstate New York, my parents developed a habit every February of taking our vacation in February, and we weren't in school yet when this began, and they would drive all the way down to Florida to get a few days of warm sunshine because it was just cloudy and cold and snowy for so long. My grandparents would go with us. And then even when we moved down south from New York to Washington, D.C. area, they would drive down to Washington, and then my grandparents would go with us to Florida. 1957 Pontiac Sky Chief. Mom and Dad in the front seat, Grandpa and Grandma in the back seat. Usually they would sit in the middle with the 2 boys on either side so we didn't fight with each other. And we're driving through Central Florida. I think I'm somewhere around 8 years old, sitting at the window looking out. And for the first time in my life, I saw pump jacks. I know you have them. We drove by some in California. Those little pumps to pump up oil out of the ground. I'd never seen one before. I said, "Grandpa, what's that?" He said, "That's called a pump jack. It pumps oil out of the water. Out of the ground. We use oil to make gasoline to run the car that we're in right now." And without a moment's hesitation, as I remember it, I said, "What happens when we suck out all the oil?" And it was the most obvious question in the world to me. My grandpa said, "Oh, that'll never happen, Brian." He said, "The Lord put in enough oil to last us until the return of Christ." And he was a very spiritual, very pious man. And I respected that about him. He was absolutely sincere. This was not a platitude. It was his sincere belief. He looked at the world as if it was like a grocery store that was stocked, and he didn't understand ecology. I would imagine it's a word he never heard in his life and never uttered, right? In his mind, everything existed for human beings. God created the world all for human beings. We were the point. And the drama of the earth was preparing for our destination after this life. And of course, millions and hundreds of millions of people believe that today. They believe that's necessary, a part of their religious identity. So it was a completely sincere answer. And I remember sitting next to him and thinking, I love this guy. I think he's funny. He's one of my favorite people. But I don't buy this. And one of the reasons is my grandfather was born in 1893. Never had a passport. Only times he left New York State, with one exception, is when he went to Florida with my parents. For him, the world was unimaginably huge, with unlimited resources. I mean, we could never exhaust it. And that's the way the world was to him. I being just, less than 10 years old, I had lived when people went up in space and took photographs of the Earth from space. And I think it was a year or 2, 3 years after that when people landed on the moon and then took pictures of the Earth from the moon. For me, the Earth was a blue and white dot in a big, vast space. And so when he told me that we were taking gasoline out, I pictured it like a beach ball. Every time you take a little bit out, it's going to deflate a little bit. This can't go on forever. And in many ways, the drama of our lifetimes is that of Earth's 8+ billion people, a lot of people still see the Earth more like my grandfather than like 8-year-old me. And we're all trying to come to terms with it, what it means to live in the world we actually live in. So that's why I say that doom is the feeling that comes when we realize that our problems have grown bigger than our solutions. We have solved all of our problems by sucking things out of the earth and processing them and producing wastes. What happens when the way you solve your other problems now creates one of the biggest problems that we've ever faced as a species? Psychologists call this fright without escape. So I structured the book around our psychological experience of trying to come to terms with what it means to live as creatures, part of this biosphere, part of this planet. And I used a very familiar pattern. Some people call it theory U. In Christian terminology, this is called the Paschal mystery, or in the language of the mystics, the path of descent. That you don't go up without going down first. And there's a phase of letting go where you let go of your illusions. The illusion that we can suck everything we need out of the earth and there will always be more. The illusion that capitalism will solve all our problems and create no serious problems. It's an appropriate place to laugh. All kinds of illusions that we let go of. And disillusionment is a painful process, but we all realize we're better off without harmful illusions. Then comes letting be. When you let go of enough, you get to a place where for the first time in your life, you say, I don't know what to do. I don't know the way out. And something happens. Psychologists who study our brains tell us that our left hemisphere is focused attention, and the right hemisphere of our brain is open awareness. And when you always know the solution, or you always know the trick, you're always in your left brain. But something happens when you get to a place where you say, none of my tricks work, none of my methods, my tools, my mechanisms work anymore. You slip back into the right part of your brain where you have to admit, I don't know. I just got to open my eyes. I don't have an answer available. And what's interesting is when you move into open awareness, there might be new possibilities you never were capable of seeing before. And that's the letting come phase. And when new things come, the possibility then of being set free to live without your previous illusions and now new perspectives, new frameworks, new assumptions, that process becomes possible. And at their best, our religious traditions guide people through this process. At their worst, our religious traditions actually punish people who go through this process. So that's how I structured the book. And let me just see if I can. So the starting point is to try to understand our current situation. Experts are calling this our polycrisis or our multi-crisis. We have a number of discrete crises, each of which is interrelated with the others, and each of which makes the others more difficult to solve. So How do we live with the planet? How do we seek peace with one another? How do we distribute power? How do we define profit? And how do we shape purpose and meaning? I was a preacher for 24 years, so I got to start them all with the same letter, right? But when you put these problems together, you try to solve problems with the planet. That makes it harder to keep peace with each other. Because one of the ways that we've kept peace with each other, in fact, you're going to hear about something called tariffs this week, right? We're having a big thing about trade. One of the ways we've kept from killing each other so much since our 2 world wars of the previous century is by increasing global trade. Because if the rich people of every country are making a lot of money through trading with other countries, they'd rather not have their wealth stream interrupted by warfare. And when people are getting cheaper products because we have political relationships to have trade relationships, we don't want to be at war with those people because we need their televisions or we need their lumber and all the rest. And so part of what's going on right now is a lot of the rules that have helped us keep peace by exploiting the planet and sending things from different parts of the planet to different buyers in the planet. You can see those problems are related. Exploiting the planet has been super, super profitable for the last 500 years, starting with the conquistadors who started this global trade process. And what it did is it concentrated power, first in Europe, then in Europe and America, concentrated power among certain classes of people in certain countries, and huge amounts of power. Often one form of power is money, and so concentrated power among a small group of people who then could exploit the earth and exploit human labor to maximize their profit. And then how do we define profit? Defining profit as individually hoarded wealth as opposed to defining profit as the common good. Deeply embedded in us, and changing people's definition of profit is very, very tough. It's like asking basketball players to try the rules of football or we're just in one game and we're well trained. Some of us are stars at one game. And how do we define winning? How do we define profit? And then how do we shape purpose and meaning? We've traditionally depended on our religious communities to help us get a sense of purpose and meaning, values and character to help us solve our other problems. But when you put all of these together, now we're having problems in all of these areas, and each makes the others harder to solve. If you want to understand our planetary problem, thankfully, the kinds of people who would show up on a Sunday afternoon are probably very familiar with climate change. But listen, anyone who studies this will eventually tell you, climate change is not the problem, it's a symptom of the problem. And the deeper problem is overshoot. And overshoot is a simple concept to understand, but I have to warn you, once you understand this, you will never be able to see the world the same way again. What I'm about to tell you is like learning about where babies come from, right? Things change, right? So here it is. Overshoot is what happens when you suck more resources out of the earth than the earth can replenish. That's what I was seeing in the back seat of my Pontiac, when I was a boy. And overshoot is about what happens when you pump out more waste products than the earth can detoxify. Sucking out more resources than the earth can replenish, pumping out more waste products than the earth can detoxify. Once you understand that balance, right? Our ancestors for 250,000 years since our species emerged lived where they would not suck out more resources than the earth could replenish, at least not on a planetary scale. And they didn't pump out more. In fact, they pumped out very, very little that we could call waste that wasn't immediately detoxified by the earth. So we entered into a condition of overshoot long, long ago, and like a lot of things, it slowly accelerated but in the lifetime of us in this room has become one of those hockey stick charts. And climate change is one of our most urgent examples of it. But listen, if climate change wasn't a problem, nothing in what I'm going to share with you today would be less true, because we're experiencing overshoot in relation to soil. We're experiencing overshoot in relation to our oceans. We're experiencing overshoot in just area after area of life. That's our planet problem. How do we seek peace? By having domination pyramids of some people who use violence to dominate other people. And we're finding out that the attitude of domination over the earth and the attitude of domination of humans over humans is a kind of multi-layered violence that we're running to the end of our rope on. How do we distribute power? And we've traditionally done this by concentrating power and wealth in a few people who agree to a set of rules to run the earth. Part of what you're going to see in the headlines, you've seen in the last several weeks, is people are changing the rules of how the powerful share power. How do we define profit? I mentioned individually hoarded wealth. And how do we shape meaning and purpose? And you understand, our religious communities succeeded in giving people a sense of meaning and purpose to keep humanity going through some very tough times in the past. We're hitting this rough patch at a time when all of Earth's major organized religions are struggling or declining. And those of you who are Christians, it's not just Christianity. All of our major religions, especially when you take out the factor of birth rates, our religions are changing. It showed up, if you looked at the 4 largest religions in the world 20 years ago, it would have been Christianity with about 33% of the world's population. It would have been Islam with about 24%. It would have been Hinduism with about 17%. But what's happened in the last few years is a 4th new religion has replaced Hinduism in 3rd place. So now it's Christianity, Islam, and the non-religious. 3rd largest religious grouping, about 18% of the world's population, most of whom have come from Christians, Muslims, and Hindus who are leaving affiliation with their faith. So right at a time when we wish we had people who are experts in helping us develop meaning and character and belonging to help us work together, we're losing that glue and we're turning on each other. And I don't have to tell us anything about that because we're seeing it every day in our headlines. Sorry, I'm going to get this to go. I maybe broke it again. Let's see. Could you take me to the next slide? Thanks. I see. And so we might say, well, what does that mean to have the instability in these interrelated problems? And what it means is we become aware that our civilization is only stable when it's growing. It's like a bicycle that you have to keep moving, and as soon as you reach a certain as soon as you slow your speed, it's in danger of falling over. Or an airplane that if you don't go fast enough, you lose your rise and you face the possibility of crash. And one of the reasons that many of you would show up on a Sunday afternoon is because in your nervous system, you have felt, oh no, this whole thing could fall apart. Oh no, this thing isn't as strong as I thought it was. I think a lot of us felt it on January 6, 2021. We never thought we would see an armed assault a violent assault on the Capitol. I'll tell you, my wake-up moment was in August of 2017 when 2 clergy friends of mine contacted me and said, and they're clergy or they were clergy in Charlottesville, Virginia, and they said, Brian, you may not have heard, but the Ku Klux Klan has been very active. There's a group of people who want to have a civil war, and they want to make Charlottesville the capital of the new Confederacy after the Civil War, and they're going to have a really big rally in August. And we're trying to organize clergy to be a presence here, kind of a counter-protest to these, it was called the Unite the Right Rally, these right-wing, fascist, neo-fascist, white supremacist groups. And they're all descending on Charlottesville. We have a large Jewish community. We want the Christian clergy to stand because there's a strong anti-Semitic strain in this. We want the Christian clergy to stand, to protect the neighborhood where the synagogue is, and we have minority populations, and the white supremacists, we're worried what they'll do to them. And so they said, we're getting a lot of women clergy, we're getting a lot of clergy of color. We're really having trouble getting white male clergy to come to this thing. And they said, is there any chance you could come? They said, you need to know it's going to be dangerous. We have intelligence that tells us there's going to be a lot of weapons there, and so I at that moment had the moral quandary. By the way, I'm honored to have my wife Grace here. I had the moral quandary: do I tell Grace the whole thing that they told me in their invitation? And I told her, and she said, "Well, it's okay for you to go as long as you don't get killed." So I was in Charlottesville that weekend, and I never thought I would see people carrying Nazi flags walking down a street, chanting Nazi slogans. I never thought this would happen. And I had this feeling, and I saw how organized these people were. And I should tell you, and I was given access. There were a group of people who posed as white supremacist neo-Nazis so they could join these groups, and they were there kind of as spies. And they made available the screenshots of all of their communications. They had been communicating using gaming platforms. And this thing was so incredibly, it looked like a military operation. I saw it. I was standing there seeing it. And I was given the screenshots of the communications. And I'll just tell you, I felt my nervous system activated. This problem is bigger than our solutions, right? And so when we realize that things are shaky, we have to suddenly get realistic. If I were to ask you, which of the ancient civilizations has survived until today, it wouldn't be a trick question. You'd all get it right. None of them survived. And then if I were to say, well, how long will our civilization last? Some part of us wants to say forever, even though we know it's unlikely. And so what starts to happen is we start having to get savvy about civilizations. It turns out there's a field called collapsology of people anthropologists, economists, political scientists, sociologists, social psychologists, who've been studying this process. When civilizations grow, their growth creates problems. When they solve those problems, they continue growing. But some problems cost more to solve than they can afford, or can't be solved at any price. And some of those problems might be internal, some of them might be external. But either way, when a civilization can no longer solve the problems it faces, it stops growing, and then it can maybe be on sort of a stasis for a little while, or sort of a plateau for a little while, but eventually it stops growing and becomes vulnerable to collapse. And then when collapse happens, the civilization unravels, and it begins to decline in cohesion, in wealth, in power, and in complexity. And eventually its population declines. And that can either happen suddenly, as has happened a few times with civilizations. More often it happens in a stair-step fashion, that things are going along like this, and then they get a little worse. People get used to that, think maybe it'll get better, and then it gets worse again. And that stair-step decline can happen over a number of centuries even. In fact, the fall of Rome is an interesting example. It's very hard to date the fall of Rome because Rome reached a peak and then went through a series of stair steps. Some historians would say, well, the ultimate fall came in 410 when Alaric invaded Rome and the Roman Senate fled. And there was literally no government left. The ruling, some of the rich people of Rome had to come to the current pope and say, hey, would you run the empire for us? We kind of need some help here. And what a crazy time that must have been. But there were two of many leading Christian figures in the Roman Empire at that time, St. Jerome and St. Augustine. And you see two interesting reactions. St. Jerome said, I was wavering between hope and despair. When the Roman Empire was decapitated, the whole world perished in one city. If Rome can perish, what can be safe? Meanwhile, Augustine, who was across the Mediterranean, maybe had a little more distance, he said, do not lose heart, brethren. There will be an end to every kingdom or civilization. And what Augustine realized is, and in fact, one of his most famous books was written to help people negotiate this, that if you think, here's the Roman Empire, and here are human beings. The empire is a system. It's a civilization. And human beings, if you happen to be born in it, that's life as you've known it. But what had to happen is human beings had to disentangle themselves and let the system die and then participate in the birth of some new system. Does that make sense? And what Augustine was really trying to do is help people say, this thing has collapsed, and we're going to have to figure out a new way to live now. And we may be, well, we certainly are in this situation in some ways. We don't know how far this is going to go. We don't know how many flights of stairs we're going to go down in our lifetimes, but we're facing some changes. So the main contribution that I think I make to this whole discussion in this book, Life After Doom, is I tried to survey all the literature. And as people have come up to me and said, wow, Brian, that was a hard book to read. I can't imagine how hard it must have been to write. And it was tough. It was tough. I had to take some long walks. I felt my own nervous system very activated as I was trying to face the information. Because what happens in a society like ours is we have specialists in different fields. Thinking of climate change and the larger problem of overshoot. We have people spend their whole careers studying one ice shelf in one of our polar ice glacier fields and so on. We have people who study very specific, people who study one ocean current, an important ocean current that runs from the South Atlantic across the equator, up across the North Atlantic, comes down beside Europe, runs back down again. They spend their whole lives studying the dynamics of that ocean current. We have people who spend their whole lives studying soil or studying different aquifers where water is distributed underneath the soil. We have people who study these things, and it takes all of their time and energy to understand this one thing, and they present it in their field. We don't have that many people who try to understand what's going on in these discrete fields and get some sense, how does it all fit together? By the way, we have the scientists doing it. Then we have the sociologists doing it, and the political scientists doing it. You try to get the big picture, and it's not as easy as you might think. But when we grapple with the big picture, I tried to make a contribution to this discussion of helping us understand 4 scenarios. One of these is almost certainly in our future. And it could be more than one, because you could have one for 100 years that leads to another. And the 4 scenarios, very simple. Collapse avoidance. We're at this period of growing complexity, and then we reach this point where we stop solving problems. And our problems start getting worse than our solutions. But somehow, before it's too late, we pull together and address the conditions that are really there. We find a way to work together and do what needs to be done, and we avoid collapse. Collapse avoidance. Second, no, we don't pull together, we pull apart. No, we don't face reality. We indulge in all kinds of conspiracy theories and wishful, magical thinking that one person's going to fix it all. And when that happens, we will collapse. Now, then the question is, well, how bad is the collapse? And so scenario 2 is the collapse is bad enough that it makes us face reality. Among other realities, it makes us understand overshoot. Because the human race is not going to survive if we don't start learning with what overshoot is. 8 billion people sucking out as much as we suck out and pumping out as much as we pump out. 8 billion people. We would need 4.5 planet Earths to continue with our current population in its current civilizational form. And maybe that's even optimistic. But things get bad enough, and we say, we got to change things. We do what needs to be done. And then there's a kind of rebirth that could happen. Third option, we don't do it now. We don't do it soon. Things get bad. Things get worse. Finally, at the last possible minute, we do what needs to be done so that some number of people survive, but our civilization doesn't. And the life for the people who survive will probably be more like the life of people a couple of centuries ago, pre-technological life, than the kind of life that we assume is civilized life. And the fourth is that, let me just say it this way. If we burn all the fossil fuels that are owned by all the oil companies right now, in other words, there's no way out of this unless the oil companies decide not to burn a lot of their assets, not to profit from a lot of their assets. If we burn it all, we raise the temperatures of the earth so much over the next couple of hundred years that we create so much sea level rise because of melting glaciers, that we destabilize the natural environment so much that even our ocean currents these beautiful currents that took millions of years to form and we've depended on for the whole time the human species has existed, those are disrupted, creating all kinds of climactic change and chaos. This would result in so much mass migration and all the rest that human beings some idiot somewhere would press a red button. And within seconds, idiot somewhere else would press another red button. And then you create situations where human extinction is imaginable. Now, you all know, if you know anything about risk management, if you have a monumental risk that is 10% likelihood of happening, you have to take it seriously. A risk that big, 10% chance of it happening is too much, right? So you have to minimize that risk. If it's not that serious, it could have a 30% chance of happening. You say, oh, we'll deal with it. But what we're dealing with in scenario 4 is an unimaginable risk. And so if you've just processed that, your nervous system just took in a lot. But that, I think, is an honest appraisal of where we are. But here's the problem. To do anything about this is going to require people to manage the stress of this letting go phase. And this is going to require, for us to not freak out and make everything worse, we're going to have to help people manage letting go of some of their illusions that they thought were certainties. And I'm not going to go into this in detail now, but the way I talk about it in the book is that we're going to have to learn to understand that our nervous system has kind of 3 tiers to it. I call it your internal board of directors, the board of directors of you incorporated. And it has a survival committee that's job is to keep you alive. It's what manages your fight, flight, freeze, fawn, flock, and reproductive instincts. And your survival committee, it's going to be activated a lot, and we're going to have to learn how to face that tension, that anxiety. Then your belonging committee. Well, we're trying to survive. Our belonging committee is what makes us connect with other people. And suddenly we find Our families are being divided by politics, and our nation is being divided. And I don't think the thought of a civil war, or let's just say a civil disunion, where certain states would break away from the all these things start to become, wow, that could actually happen in my lifetime. And how do we manage our belonging, our sense of connection? Our individual identity begins as part of a group identity. And then comes the meaning committee of your internal board of directors. You try to make sense of it. You try to understand it. You try to figure out a sensible response. And if you think about what's going on in your consciousness every day, you're having, at the speed of electrons, negotiations running between those parts of your brain. And no wonder you're tired at the end of the day. Because this is a lot of hard work that we're being asked to manage. And so I think what's going to be happening, what's already happening, it's probably why you felt it was worth it to come here today, is we're going to all have to say, we used to be able to take our civilization for granted. And we used to be able to do that because we could take the earth for granted. And now we're waking up to say, how can we come together? And how can we face these realities? And how can I learn to be a productive contributor rather than just somebody who's freaking out and angry and curling into the fetal position, all of which you need to do when you need to do them. But then we say, okay, I don't want to be stuck here. And this is one of the things that I think our religious communities could really be a big help to. Not only our religious communities, but also our psychological communities. We're going to have to get all hands on deck to help us as individuals face these realities sensibly. Because if we don't, our state of anxiety and being freaked out all the time make us very, very receptive to authoritarians. And one way to understand what's going on, not just in our country, but around the world, is that as problems are not being solved, people's stress levels rise, and authoritarians become like an ecstatic relief. I don't need to worry about this. Somebody else promised me he can solve all the problems. And you can see the appeal of that kind of authoritarian thinking. So there's the process, letting go, letting be, letting come, setting free. And before we stop for a break, I want to share one last understanding with you that has been helpful for me in thinking about what we face. It's an insight that comes from biology, but then it turns out astrophysicists use the same model, and I think there are deep, speaking as a Christian theologian, Christian theology integrates with this very, very deeply, as do other faith traditions. But the way it's used often in biology, they talk about this four-phase process, and they use a kind of twisted circle or infinity loop to convey this. That anything that happens in this universe requires energy. And certain factors arise to exploit available energy and other resources. And they exploit until they then have control of that resource, and then they conserve as long as they can, but eventually the resource might run out or be interfered with, and that takes them through the conservation phase to a release phase when their hold on things is broken. And that release phase happens and then leads to a reorganization phase, and the reorganization phase then creates the conditions where new energy is released and a new circuit can begin. You probably learned about this in high school, maybe, when you learned about forest succession. Imagine a landscape covered in magma. There's nothing alive, just sterilized rock. But if you've ever been to a volcanic zone, it doesn't take long, and there's little lichen that begins to form on the rocks, and algae that forms, and then little tiny herbaceous grasses form, and other little plants. Eventually, they die, and they create a little more soil when they die, which makes possible perennial plants and grasses. Before you know it, you have shrubs growing. Before you know it, you have short-lived pioneer trees, and eventually a climax forest comes. And that climax forest may hold. Grace and I just visited Sequoia National Park. I mean, what an incredible, you Californians really have a nice state here. And we looked at those sequoia trees, 1,800, 2,000, 3,000 years old, and you think, that's a lot of conservation. And then something happens. It might be a new little beetle comes into the territory. It might be the temperatures rise so that that new little beetle can kill more and more trees. It might be weather conditions change so there's a lot more lightning. Whatever it is, a forest fire happens and those trees are destroyed. Now that's destruction. Those trees are not happy after that's happened, right? Or when that's happening. It's tragic for them. But think about it. All of the resources that were kept in the bank of those tall trunks now are released back into the soil. And now, see how thick the soil is? That's because of centuries of the climax forest building the soil. And so now the system, the cycle begins again, but it has a new arrangement of energy available the second time around. And so we are having to face the possibilities of what it means if we're somewhere in the conservation phase, maybe the end of the conservation phase, the beginning of the release phase. What is that going to mean for us? And it's going to have a lot of ramifications for us, especially those of us who are parents, who want to prepare, or grandparents, and want to prepare our children and grandchildren for a different world than we grew up in. And when we ask that question, issues like suddenly spirituality becomes important in ways that it maybe hasn't seemed important when we had a fossil-fueled civilization that had solutions to all of our problems, it seemed. And so this is patterns we've seen. In the Christian scriptures, we talk about life, death, resurrection. See that pattern. In the Hebrew scriptures, there was creation, and then the patriarch period, and then enslavement in Egypt, and then an Exodus period, and a new beginning in the Promised Land. And in the Promised Land, there was another pattern that led to exile, and then return from exile. We see this pattern again and again, and we're going to have to rediscover, those of us in religious traditions, to rediscover that our scriptures are actually the library of indigenous wisdom, of people who were resisting colonizing empires that had an unsustainable relationship with the earth and with the poor. And we're at a place where maybe we now start to understand that there are ways of orienting ourselves, whether you call them religious or spiritual, whatever you call them, ways of orienting ourselves to the earth and toward each other and to life and time that we're going to need. We can't, the patterns that brought us this far are going to not be as helpful going forward. And so I have not solved the problem for you. I've tried to help you understand, I think, more accurately our current situation. And we're going to take a break. We'll give you some instructions about that in a minute. Then we'll come back and we'll have some time for questions and discussion. And I'm really interested in hearing what's on your mind, what your reactions are. This is kind of a summary of the first 2 chapters of the book. And so a lot of territory. Any instructions should I get?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's thank Brian. I know a good number of you have traveled from far distances to be here for this afternoon. Would you say it was worth it? Yeah. Amen. And it's not even over yet. Some of you just came from down the street to be here. Would you say it was worth it? Some of you who were here this morning and didn't even leave and just stuck around. We're so grateful for all of you being present to be a part of this conversation. As Brian mentioned, we will have a very little stretch break, bathroom break for about 15 minutes and then come back. And then we're going to have a time of Q&A and hear some of your questions. It'll be moderated by one of our members of this church who I think is really qualified to moderate this conversation. I'll introduce him when we get back. But before I send you off to the break, how many of you are in any sort of group together or have been in a group together to study this book? It is great to do it in a group, I think, because as a lot of you have experienced, and as Brian pointed out, so many people start reading this, and it's heavy. You know, it's difficult to get through, but in community, I think there is greater wisdom and opportunities to kind of work through things that seem very, very difficult, and that's part of the vision of doing this here. We had a group in this church at San Ramon Valley United Methodist Church that studied this in the fall, about 12 to 15 people that gathered over Zoom every Wednesday evening. And that was really the genesis of inviting Brian McLaren here. I do want to give a very special thank you to a few of those individuals that were part of that group and worked so hard to make this afternoon happen. And I don't know where they're seated, but Sylvia Benzler, where are you? Stand up, Sylvia. She's there in the back. Lucinda Huffaker, Lucinda. And Ginny Ferreira in the back. And there are many others who have supported the logistics and the planning and the coordination. I also want to give a shout out to our Director of Communications, Sarah Stribling, who's done a phenomenal job of promoting this event, and that's how word got out to you, so thank you, Sarah. So we are going to take a break. There are restrooms in Wesley Center. There's a one in the back and one kind of on the front side of the church, but we have some of our church members helping direct you. 15 minutes, we will be back at 2:50, and then we will begin our Q&A.
Testing, testing, testing. 1, 2, 3, 4.
Yeah, you're
1,
on.
2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4.
You're
1,
on.
2, 3.
I think I can hear you.
Oh.
All right, everyone. 15 minutes seems to go by really fast.
Two people did it.
Great.
We doubled up.
Thank you.
That's good.
Want to invite you to come back and please take your seats. Let me adjust you a little bit here.
1, 2, 3,
There we
4.
go.
Can you hear it?
All right, come on in, folks, and please find your seats. All right, so as the remaining people filter in, let me just explain to you that we've set about 1 hour and 10 minutes for this time of Q&A. And after that, for those of you who can stay, we invite you to join us in the Wesley Center. That will be your opportunity to meet Brian. Maybe if you brought a book to be signed, he will be there to sign your book. But also, very importantly, we have different advocacy groups that have set up information tables around the Wesley Center, and you will definitely want to stop by each of those tables to find out a little bit more information about how to get involved in some of this work that we're talking about. For our time, for this moment, for our Q&A, I'm so happy to introduce to you Lynn Arscott, one of our members of San Ramon Valley United Methodist Church. He has been a member here for 40 years, 4 decades. Yeah, you can woo and clap for that. That is no small feat. And Lynn has a great background and experience in environmental work. And he is an engineer by trade. I'm going to have him introduce himself and tell a little bit about what he's done in his life. His resume and curriculum vitae is very long. I looked him up on Google, and I had to keep scrolling. So I'm going to just have Lynn introduce himself, and he will have a time of conversation with Brian, and then we're going to move into a time of asking for some questions from all of you. Okay? Would you help me welcome Lynn Arscott?
Well, thank you, Sam. Can you hear this okay? Mike's testing. Just for me to share with you where I'm coming from here, and then we'll get into the meat of the discussion. I've been a member of the Methodist Church for most of my life, started with the Baptist Church, but now with the Methodist Church, and this church for 40 years. Churches are a big part of my life. They're very important. I've just been through a loss of my wife. This church family was a savior for me. I cannot say enough about how important church family is, the important role of churches in society. We help each other, we serve society. So churches are important. The other aspect that's important to me is the environment. Now, I was an environmental manager for a major corporation, and I've spent most of the last 40 years working either professionally or for environmental issues. We are so lucky to have someone here today that's going to help us marry the spiritual world and this big environmental problem we have. I've been fighting this, not fighting it, studying it, struggling with it, spirituality and the environment. And where I've come out is that there is a very, very strong spiritual connection to environment. All life is connected. Brian went through the exercise of the oxygen, and you can go through the whole of your atoms. They come, they go. We're connected. It's a spiritual world, and part of it's the environment. So what I hope we can do in this session is maybe come up with some ideas, and we want to make it participative. You're going to ask questions, but also make suggestions when we get there of perhaps how we might move forward as spiritual faith communities in this challenge. I sort of felt when Brian was talking to us, there was a lot of the doom there, and I'm telling myself, okay, I get it. Now we got to do something about it. So I'm going to ask the first question, but do we have the two microphones ready? I guess they are, the Lucinda and Sylvia. So let me, Brian, ask you the first question. You have a very long background in the church. You came from a very fundamentalist theology to a very, now I think what I would call a progressive theology. How do you think churches have to move forward now to build this spiritual connection to the environment? And what I'm talking about is a change of culture in our society. I'll say that again because I helped do this in an industrial society. We have to change the culture. How do we do it, and what should churches be doing?
Yeah, Lynn, well, thanks for that. So let's start with, I just want to affirm what you just said, that we need a change in civilization. We need a change in culture. Listen, I am for everything we as individuals can do about this, but we cannot solve this as individuals. If you ask Bill McKibben, one of my heroes, people often ask him, well, what can I do as an individual? Bill says, stop thinking like an individual. We have to start thinking of linking our human individuality together to create groups that become movements, that create movements to change values and change our culture at large. That's not an easy process. So and then what churches can do, let me maybe say three things about that. First thing I'd say is, look, anything anybody does to nudge us in the right direction, I am all for. We need all kinds of people doing the next thing they can. So when we drove up here today, the first thing I saw was the solar panels on top of this church building. And I thought, what a beautiful thing. Because that not only is a good thing, saves money for this church, it helps this church be less dependent on fossil fuels, more dependent on solar energy. All of that is really, really great. It also sets an example for other people. So other churches and individuals might say, well, I'm going to try to do that too. I'm all for all of that. But what is going to have to happen is the fundamental understandings we have of what civilizations are, what economics are, all the rest. We're going to have change that makes all of our little individual changes, gives them meaning, but it's part of something much, much bigger. So the first thing I'd say is we have to do what we can as individuals. A lot of what you do as an individual will simply be an expression that you care. You care, and you can buy a car that's less damaging to the environment, so you do it. You care, you can switch to solar energy. You care, you can consume less. You can, all of those things are beautiful. They're an expression of you caring. If you cared and didn't do anything, you wouldn't really care, right? So, or if you cared and didn't do anything, you would be creating psychological, cognitive dissonance within yourself. So doing those things is important. But one of the things we have to do is imagine that a different kind of society is possible that lives in a different relationship to the earth. And that is where religious communities come in. Oh my goodness. Could we just come back tomorrow? Because I'd love to talk for an hour about this. But let me start with Karl Marx. You all know Karl Marx's famous saying that religion is the opiate of the masses. When he said that, here's what he meant. He wasn't trying to criticize religion. He was actually, in a way, trying to praise religion to say this. He was saying that the economic system that he was seeing develop in the mid-1800s in Europe was crushing people. It was hurting people. It was making them have to work harder and harder to survive. And they were living in, you've read David Copperfield or, you know that literature that gives us a feeling for what life was like for the vast majority of poor people in the beginning of industrialization. People were suffering. And he said what religion does, when he said opiates were painkillers. So he's saying religion helps people deal with the pain of being in a miserable situation. But if that's all we do, see if you can follow me in this. Here's how here's how Dietrich Bonhoeffer said it. Dietrich Bonhoeffer said, we have to, pull people who are being crushed by the machinery of an evil system. But he says sooner or later, we have to stick a stake in the spokes of the machine. Dorothy Day said, when I stand up for the poor, they call me a saint. When I ask why so many people are poor, they call me a communist. So we can say, let's help poor people. Well, in a certain way, when you help poor people who are being paid an inadequate wage, you're subsidizing the company that's paying them an inadequate wage. If you didn't subsidize them, they couldn't keep working. And that company couldn't keep paying them an adequate wage. Do you understand? I'm all for charity. I'm all for charity. But what they were saying is we've got to see the larger systems that are at work. And if we start to pay attention to the larger systems that are at work, our churches can do a couple of things. They can help us understand systemic evil that's different from individual evil. They can help us see how systems themselves the systems need changing. And our religious communities, especially if you're in a denomination, could organize for systemic change. It has happened before, and it could happen again. Civil rights movement, a huge part of the civil rights movement was when Jewish, Protestant, Catholic, and other religious communities came together, marched together. You've probably seen the pictures of Martin Luther King Jr. and Rabbi Abram Joshua Heschel marching together. Across races, they organized people. Our religious communities could help us organize. Now, there will be a cost to that. And here's the problem. Right now, we're in a politically polarized situation, so that if you say, we need to care for the earth, people will say, you're being political. I live in Florida. I was born in New York, then moved to Maryland. I've been going south my whole life. I live in Florida. Florida has had the highest per capita rate of lynchings in the country. A state with a deeply racist history. Listen, if anyone in the 1700s, 1800s brought up how the American nation was treating indigenous people and how the American nation was treating kidnapped African human beings and enslaving them, if you would have brought that up and said, I don't think this is right, you know what they would have said? You're being political. You're not allowed to talk about that in church. And so churches didn't talk about it. In fact, I'll just say, I was a pastor for 24 years. I'm a big fan of forgiveness, right? But when I imagine across the American South, millions of white Christians going to church week after week, and in very general terms, saying that they confess their sins, and then a pastor or priest say, "You are forgiven," I want to throw up. I want to throw up. Something about that is sick. Like, let's not talk about the most fundamental sin of racism and enslavement of other human beings. And we're there confessing that maybe we were a little snippy with the kids the other night or something. Which, don't be snippy with your kids, but, so teaching systemic racism and organizing people to address things when you have organizational capacity to do that, super, super, super important. I'll get real specific and then we can move on to another question if you want. Like, I want you to imagine that every year, instead of maybe devoting one sermon to the environment, maybe around Earth Day, we were to say, every prayer of confession, where we confess our sins, we have to confess that we're living with the earth in an unsustainable and unjust way. And we're living with the poor in an unjust way as well. Every prayer, we have to make sure that we stop singing songs and hymns that make it sound like the only purpose in being in earth is to go to heaven when you're done. Look, "I'll Fly Away" is a fun old bluegrass tune, gospel tune, but the purpose of the Christian life is not to fly away to heaven. If you're a Christian, the purpose of the Christian life is to make a difference while you're freaking alive, So we got to get rid of those songs. And we need songs that celebrate the goodness of the earth. When I was a boy, I loved nature. And we used to sing "Fairest Lord Jesus," which I loved because it said, "Fair is the sunshine, fair is still the moonlight, fair all the twinkling starry hosts." You know what the next line is? Jesus is fairer. Like, the only reason we lift up creation is to say Jesus is better. I'm just thinking that's a whole spirituality that divorces the spirit from matter. And so what if ever our songs started, we need new songs and hymns written that help us savor and praise the beauty of God that is seen in the beauty of, I'll say as someone who spent the week visiting California, in sequoias and in rocky coastlines and in Stellar's jay. What a bird, and that would help us bring together the spiritual. Yeah, that's a good place we could go on.
Well, you've heard a very strong statement. Do you agree with what he's saying? There you go. What I'm hearing here is we do need a movement. We need another Reformation. And could one of the microphones go? Where's Dave Coombs? I just want you to make the comparison with previous Reformations, Dave. Here's Sylvia coming. Hang on a minute. She's got the microphone. And just state your name. Try not to be too long. We would like you to share as well as maybe ask a question. Go ahead.
This is on? Yeah. I have a two-part question.
Could you put it right up to your mouth?
I'm a history of American Christianity, and I've given a history lesson to this congregation. In the post-Civil War period, we had what was called the social gospel movement, led by people like Washington Glad and Walter Rauschenbusch. And it appears to me that we need a new social gospel movement related to our earth. Yeah. Secondly, in the 1970s, Jerry Falwell went around this country organizing the Southern Baptists and other fundamentalist churches to politicize, and he politicized religion. So First question, do you agree that we need a social gospel movement? And second question is, are you the person to lead that? And if not you alone, who else is out there
Yes.
that can carry the mantle? Because the social gospel dealt with child labor laws, temperance movement, alcoholism, the social ills of the time, and climate is our social ill
Yes.
that is.
Oh, well, thank you. What a great, I think that question deserves an applause. So, okay. But what was your first question?
Do we need a social movement?
But you see, well, okay. Yes. Well, okay. First, I'm so glad you make a comparison to the social gospel movement, late 1800s, early 1900s. And a lot of you've never heard of it. And the reason you've never heard of it is because it succeeded. In other words, every cause that movement took on, it made amazing progress. Child labor. A lot of people don't know Methodists led the way in animal rights. Big animal rights movement. The ASPCA, those organizations came out of an era where for the first time people said, you shouldn't be cruel to animals, even if you're about to eat them. At least let their life be good while they're alive, you know? It was powerful. Amazing. So many incredible accomplishments of that movement. Let me make a critique of the movement. I'm nothing but positive about the movement. But here's what tended to happen, is the Christian religion had developed some deep structures theologically. And what it did is it didn't address with those deeper issues very often. People like Walter Rauschenbusch did, but it didn't make its way into liturgy and theology and hymnody. And so what happened is some of the deeper structures didn't change. So they did these activities, and once they won on those issues, their theology didn't drive them onward to the next issues. Does that make sense? And to me, an incredibly important person that many of you have probably never heard of in the 20th century is Father Thomas Berry, a Catholic theologian who stopped calling himself a theologian and started calling himself a geologian, G-E-O, because he said, if we worship God and don't love the earth, then our worship of God distracts us from the earth. We need to reconnect our understanding of God and the sacredness of the earth. Let that sink in. If you have this theology that says the heavens matter, spirit matters, matter doesn't matter, then we'll just keep ignoring this earth. And so Thomas Berry had, starting in about the 1970s, 80s, he started, wherever he'd go, he said, I just want you to know three things. First, the glory of the human is becoming the desolation of the earth. Second, the desolation of the earth is becoming the destiny of the human. Third, from now on, all human activities must be judged by the degree to which they contribute to a new human-earth relationship. This was a theologian speaking. And to me, if we really want to do this right, we will not just add programs onto existing theologies that teach us not to care for the earth. And this creates a spirituality that is there in the Bible from the beginning. I love, just last week I was preaching in Southern California, and I preached on Psalm 19. Here's how this psalm begins. The heavens are telling the glory of God, and the earth is declaring God's artistry. Day to day pours forth speech. Night to night utters knowledge. There is no speech, there is no knowledge, but their message is going out through all of the earth. Meaning, it's not stuff in words, it's something deeper than words, a knowledge that's going out deeper than words. And so this spirituality that understands the value of the earth, to me, is something that the Christian religion has largely lost and needs to regain. I'll just tell you, I hope this doesn't sound proud in a really terrible way, but it's true even if it is terrible. Of all the things that I've written, there's a couple chapters in Life After Doom where I tell the story of the Bible as an indigenous library. Because I think, here's a little saying that might help you. There are two kinds of people in the world. Those who divide the world into two kinds of people and those who don't. But there are two kinds of people in the world. Indigenous people belong to the land. Colonizing people think the land belongs to them. And I think what the Bible is the literary collection of indigenous tribal people from the Middle East who kept being invaded and conquered by colonizing people who thought they could steal the land and own the land. Their deeper sin wasn't just thinking they could steal it, it's thinking that they could own it as if they were above it and not remembering that they came from the land. And I think we could rediscover in the Bible that the real thing that's going on in the Bible is trying to help us return to an indigenous mindset. And one last thing I'll say, your question gets me going about that. I'm not an expert in Eastern religions and philosophies, but I love Taoism. I think Taoism is a fascinating philosophy. And I came to understand that Lao Tzu, who is thought to be the founder of Taoism, although some people think Lao Tzu is a conglomerate of many other wise people, and that what Lao Tzu was really trying to do was recover something. That in a period where the Chinese nations were fighting each other and having wars constantly, and then now empires were developing that were gaining control over huge swaths of land, that Lao Tzu was trying to go back and regain the indigenous wisdom of pre-imperial China so that it could be preserved for people, because without indigenous wisdom, he knew that people would destroy themselves. And so it's the same sense that we belong to the land that is spiritual and sacred, and it makes us walk through the world differently than colonizers. And so all of us who were born into generations of colonizers, I think part of our true Christian conversion is to be re-indigenized. It's just something to think about. Your question about who should lead us in this, we have a lot of work to do in this. And I'm too old I want to do everything I can, but I think what we're going to need is a movement with so many leaders leading in so many different ways. And all of us who are of a certain age and up, we have to take all of our energy now and look for the people who are 14, 16, 18, 20, 24, 26. And we have to say, listen, I'm in a Methodist church, so I'm going to edit my speech. Listen, older generations have fracked up this earth. And it's horrible. And we've done what we can to try to stop this runaway freight train. But we want you to know we're getting behind you with money and encouragement and resources and belief and whatever advice we can offer. So that's what I would say.
So when Dave said, "Would you lead the movement?" your wife Grace was shaking her head, but I don't know whether that means anything. But you are leading a movement. We have on this issue of what churches may need to do better. We have a number of pastors and leaders of churches here do you agree with what he's saying? And can you in your churches change? Are you changing? There's somebody here from the Congregational Church, Lucinda over here. The question here is, you've heard Brian say, maybe we need to change. As a pastor of a church, can you change? How are you going to do this?
Sorry, I was checking my youth group text.
Can you introduce yourself? Make sure you introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm Pastor Reverend Lauren Jewett. I am the Minister for Youth and Community Engagement at the Congregational Church here in town, and I also serve our UCC conference as Minister for Youth, Young Adults, and Education. I have a lot of titles. We started talking, one, because we were just sitting next to each other, but also last week I was supposed to preach on climate change, and I weaseled my way out of preaching by instead facilitating some group sort of wisdom discernment. And to answer your question specifically, I think we have to change. We don't have a choice. We have to change, or that fourth scenario of collapse extinction is going to be more and more inevitable in a sooner and sooner timeline. But in our group discernment last week, what surprised me and what made me really glad that I didn't preach actually is that there was a real understanding in the room that, yes, solar panels and composting and electric cars, yes, all of those things. And ultimately, we have to restore this relationship we have to figure out how to not be separate. Because we've colonized, we've exploited, we've owned the natural world and forgotten that we ourselves are nature. And I love, Brian, what you did earlier with that breath orientation. I'm going to steal that, I hope, with your permission. But I think those of us who especially have been raised as doers, as thinkers, and we're not always in our bodies, we think about those concrete actions like composting and solar panels and installing heat pumps, but that's not fixing the internal need that we have. I think many of us probably feel a certain lack of meaning in our lives, and some of that comes from a lack of connection with all of the other capital L life in the world. And, we could play off of the title of this book, right? That it's not just our life, it's all life after doom. And that internal shift, we can't solve this as individuals, and yet the individual transformation is part of what has to happen in order to change the culture.
Good, thank you.
So that's what I have for you.
Thank you. Let's open it to questions. Make sure somebody with a microphone. You got it there? Go ahead. Say your name clearly.
My name is Victoria Rue, and I too am a pastor. I'm an ordained Roman Catholic woman priest. There are 250 of us in the United States, and we are all excommunicated. We wear that badge proudly. Brian, thank you for bringing us to the edge of the abyss and giving us hope beyond it. My question has to do with that house that we call Christian is a divided house in the sense that our country is now led by Christian nationalism. And Christian nationalism, from sea to shining sea, is also Christian Zionism. And both of those things together are destroying not only peace, but our earth. And so how can, and your other book, that one of your many other books that I did read is, should I stay Christian, right? So So that's my question, is how do we relate the house divided against itself, that it may be an indigenous Bible, but it is also a colonizing Bible.
Yes.
And it's been used like that,
Yes.
as you well know.
Yeah.
So I would be interested in your response
Yes.
to this house that is divided.
Yes. Your first name again?
Victoria Rue.
Victoria.
Thank you, Brian.
So, Victoria, the first thing I want to say is there are some questions that are asked that are way better than any answer. Because by asking the question, you force people to think. And sometimes when someone answers the question, people stop thinking. So part of me just wants to say thank you for the question, and we should all carry that question home with us to keep thinking about it. Because you asked my opinion, I'm going to give you my opinion, and it's, I would be happy to be wrong, but here's my opinion. My opinion is, as you know from reading this book, Do I Stay Christian? The Christian religion has done some very horrible things in the past, more horrible than most Christians know about. Catholics, Protestants, Eastern Orthodox. I think we will see worse things be done in the name of Christianity in the coming years than have ever happened in our history. By a sector of Christians. Those of us who are from a Christian background, who think that's atrocious and horrible, will do one of three things. We'll either sit silently and let it happen and continue going through our liturgies and singing our songs as if it isn't happening. To me, what a waste. But I think a lot of people will try to do it. Younger generations will grow up and think that that kind of insipid, complacent, complicit Christianity that couldn't speak out against its own members of its own religious lineage, the fact that they didn't have the courage to distinguish themselves and call out their sisters and brothers and siblings will be insipid. It will be disgusting to younger generations, and it should be. I think there will be other Christians who decide if you can't beat them, join them, and they will be sucked into it as well. I think there will be some who just drop out of religion altogether and say, I don't know what to do. And they will have a question the next morning. Okay, are you just going to be an individual, or are you going to start thinking about being affiliated with a group? And as soon as you start thinking about affiliating with a group, you got to figure out who it's going to be. And then I think there will be some of us who say, the uglier they get, the more beautiful we're going to try to be. Thank you. And the more vicious they become, the more confidently nonviolent we'll become. So we could be on the precipice of a wonderful Christian renaissance that decides the worse they get, we can no longer play this polite middle ground. The reason I mention that is that the same thing is happening in Judaism. One of my dear friends is the leader of what are called the Trua Rabbis, Truah. Their motto is one of my favorite mottos anywhere. Their motto, imagine a group of rabbis, this is their motto: resisting tyrants since Pharaoh. But now, imagine what they feel. They feel that the Israeli government is destroying Judaism morally, just as we might feel the American government affiliated with Christian nationalism, white Christian nationalism, is. So this is going. Imagine Muslims around the world who were watching, on the one hand, the ultra-rich oil tycoons who, that's their religion, and they have a cozy relationship with the religion, or watching terrorists do horrible actions, and then they think, how do we stay Muslim? So what I would say is, if people are going to stay Christian, they're either going to get worse or better. So That'll be a choice we all make. And frankly, here's what it's going to mean. I'm going to be very blunt. It's going to mean that congregations are going to have to take a stand, and some people are going to leave. And when they leave, they'll take their money with them. And it's going to mean a lot of challenges, but so be it. Yeah.
Good answer. Okay, question, there's one here, or Lucinda. Just keep your hand up.
In fact, I'll tell you a little trick. Whoever finishes asking a question, if you get the mic back to the person, then somebody else raise your hand and get the person with the mic's attention, and we'll just keep it going. Yeah.
My name's Tom. I worked over 30 years with the Federal Environmental Protection Agency, and just wanted to touch on the importance of relationship and our relationship to the earth, which we're talking about a lot, and also our relationship with each other. So it seems to me that often when we think about this, our first reaction is about stuff. It's, okay, I want to buy an electric vehicle, I want to have solar panels, and we're not first asking, what is my relationship to a car? What is my relationship to energy? And because if it feels like we're rushing into just replacing all our stuff with a greener stuff, there's still stuff, and we've, as you said, overshooting is really overconsumption. And then the other piece that in my retirement, I've been doing community gardening with a community of people around vegetable gardening, and that to me is so important in terms of recreating a relationship to the land, but then to each other and doing that in community. So I just wanted to lift those two things up as kind of ways of thinking about this that I've learned.
Your first name again?
Tom.
Tom, thank you so much, Tom. And I'm just thinking, Father Thomas Berry would be applauding from his grave to say, you're bringing us back to relationship. We need a transformed human earth, a human creation relationship. And so thank you. Yes?
Oh, yes. Go ahead, Sheila.
Hi, I'm Sheila Hassel-Hughes. I'm a professor at St. Mary's College, and I lead a nonprofit organization called Human Energy. And so it's from that perspective that I'm interested in hearing your thoughts about some ideas. I'm interested, so first of all, I'll say Human Energy is rooted in the work of the French Jesuit paleontologist Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who I think is another resource.
And he was Thomas Berry's inspiration in many ways,
Yeah,
yes.
absolutely. And the inspiration for someone else, I think you are a fan of Brian Swim, who is on our advisory board, a friend of mine. Amazing. So I was interested in what you were saying about complexity. And in Teilhard's theorizing, complexity, that evolution, Teilhard is an evolutionary scientist, evolution is always in the direction of greater complexity, from first particles, atoms, unicellular organisms, all the way up. And he theorized and argued complexity ultimately gives rise to consciousness, and that humans today are evolving in the space of collective consciousness. He was interested in the evolution of human collective consciousness, something he called the noosphere, the mind sphere, which depends essentially on the biosphere. So without the biosphere, there is no noosphere. But we are directing our future evolution as a species and as a planet. Teilhard was profoundly optimistic. And so I heard in what you were saying a kind of worry about complexity as the cause maybe, or a cause of collapse. One alternative I see is, yes, the collapse of Western civilization, the collapse of the United States as we know it. But I also see the potential for an emerging global civilization, one that depends upon increasing complexity. and a sense of collective consciousness,
Yes.
of our ultimate relatedness to all humans and all
Yes.
beings and to the planet and to the cosmos,
Yes.
which is at the heart of the work that we're doing at Human Energy.
Yes.
And I will say, I teach undergraduate students an intensive Jan term course about this. They come in pessimistic about the future, full of doom, deeply anxiety-ridden about their relationship with technology, and they come out, many of them, feeling, actually, I am not a victim of this alien technology invading my world or this doom that is happening to me, but I am an agent in a collective. And the greater collectivity we achieve, the more impact I can achieve in using technology
Yes.
and honoring the earth in a way that pushes us forward into the next evolutionary transition of what it means to be human, to become better
Yes.
human.
Okay. Thank you.
So I'm just curious to hear your thoughts about
Oh,
complexity and
thank
about
you.
Teilhard.
I love it. I love it. I love it. Thank you for this excellent question. Oh, thank you. Yeah, I want to make it very clear. I do not think complexity is the problem. I think failure to solve problems that arise as civilizations grow. That's the problem. So if you have a level of complexity, the complexity is expensive. And complexity, you can say two opposite things and they both can be true. Complexity can create fragility and complexity can create strength and resilience. And I think you find people who say one without the other and they don't realize it. But so for example, when we develop more complex brains, almost like computers demand so much energy, we needed a whole lot more calories of food to keep these brains growing. And so human species that went extinct, one of the things that maybe made them go extinct is they needed more calories to keep these great brains going. And if they couldn't get enough, their increased complexity increased their fragility. But their increased brain could give them the capacity to think, hey, maybe if we put food in fire, it would work better. And we put food in fire, and now we get 30% more calories. And that intelligence move, how to manage fire, does that make sense? So we have to think about complexity in not as a good or bad thing, but as a feature of the universe. Life is so incredibly complex. So I'm glad. I wouldn't want to give anybody the idea that I'm against complexity. But another reason that's such an insightful question, look, I'm about to get political. When the current administration decided to get rid of USAID, interesting that would be the first thing they want to get rid of. This could be stupidity. It could be malice, it could be incompetence, it could be any number of things. It could be all of the above, but part of the reason they knew it would play well with people is they think it's so complicated to try to win enemies over as friends by being good to them, by feeding them, by helping them solve their problems. It's so hard to do that. It's way simpler to just throw around power and threaten them. So in the name of simplicity, get rid of that complex stuff that isn't a punch and a fall. It's systemic, right? So it's the rejection of complexity that makes people make decisions that will increase the likelihood of their civilization's collapse. So that's why I think your question is so deeply important. Okay, now I'm going to venture into something I could be completely wrong about, because I've read Teilhard, but I'm not an expert in Teilhard. But most 20th century Christian theologians, except for the liberation theologians, I think underestimated economics. So I don't recall Teilhard talking a lot about economics. And I think when you bring economics into the equation, you have to I mean international economics and so on. I think that's a factor that I'm not for people being pessimistic. I'm just not for people being unrealistic. I think if we take economics into the conversation, it will help us. And I'll just mention something you might be interested in. Again, I'm not an expert in this. I'm learning in this area. Right now, I'm reading a Japanese socialist economist named Koji Karatani, Karatani. And the reason I was introduced to him and I'm interested in what he's saying, I'm not sure he's right, but my mind is being stretched. He makes a critique of Marx and says that Karl Marx focused on the means of production, which made sense in an industrial world, based on fossil fuels. But if we're moving into a different setting, means of production isn't the right framework. And so Karatani's saying we should look at means of exchange. And what he does is he looks at 4 kinds of exchange in human societies. One is human societies whose exchange is reciprocity. You do something for me, I'll do something for you. People whose means of exchange is domination. I'll control you, and I'll do some things for you as I control you, and you do things for me, but by letting me control you. Domination is a kind of exchange that takes place in domination. Third is exchange of commodities, transaction, capitalism. By the way, one way to look at our current administration is to say they're in a capitalist setting that's supposed to be of transaction, and everything becomes transaction, you lose all sense of respect for institutions and authorities, and you lose all sense of reciprocity, so you can turn a friend into an enemy overnight. But here's the reason I bring up Karatani. He says he thinks Marx didn't realize in critiquing capitalism that there might be something beyond capitalism that wouldn't be just a return to domination or reciprocity. There could be a new, higher level of complexity that took elements of these earlier forms of exchange into something bigger. And Karatani says the only place this has ever existed is in certain religious communities. And of course, I thought of the book of Acts that tells of the people having all things in common. And he said he basically feels we're going to destroy each other at that third level. We've got to find a fourth level of exchange, and which would be a kind of deeper kind of complexity. And I'll just say one last thing about this that is very relevant to faith communities as well as schools, and that would be, what if children were taught, we did that little exercise of breathing. What if children understood that every breath they take depends on the well-being of trees and plankton? From the very beginning, what if children were taught? This would require more complexity than our current school system that basically is training training people, especially under the new administration, to just be good capitalists. What if we said, part of what you need to be a human being in this world is this deeper understanding. Anyway, all that would be part of that solution. But thank you for bringing that up, and thank you for bringing even Teilhard's name up in this, because he's another one of a theologian who got us thinking in these deeper areas. So. Those of you who didn't hear, they're developing K-12 curriculum based on one of Teilhard's key ideas.
Consciousness to
Yes.
12th grade. There is such a thing, of course, as environmental capital, so economics should take it off. You know, we shouldn't leave today without going back to, which I think is a major issue here, is indigenous wisdom. Brian, you talked about the indigenous wisdom of Jesus. I'm thinking of the colonists came to this country they used to talk about the indigenous people having a pagan religion or animist. You hear these terms. And when I was growing up, I tended to think this was a lower level of thinking. I have now completely flipped. I think those people had it right. The spirit of the wind, spirit of the trees. Say a little more, Brian, about how do we get back to indigenous wisdom?
Yeah, when you think, when you were saying that, a friend of mine who is Shoshone background tells the story growing up in the Wind River Reservation in Wyoming of when berry season came and they were out picking berries, her older brother reprimanded her and said, "You don't pick every berry. You only pick berries in one part of the tree, one part of the bush, because we have to leave berries for the birds, and we have to leave berries for the deer and the chipmunks. So we'll just pick the lower berries, or the middle berries, the higher, whatever he said." And it makes me think, too, that every indigenous child, they have to know virtually all the plants. They didn't have a Latin name for them. They had their own names for them. They had to know which plants are good for medicine and which plants nourish you in different ways. They didn't get that from someone else, from going to school. They got it from their grandmothers passing it on generation after generation. So there is a deeper wisdom and connection to the earth. And what we did as colonizers is we forgot about all of that. And we then said, you need to know a lot of other kinds of information, and that just wasn't important anymore. So somehow there has to be a basic education of our relationship with the earth. And when you mention, there's a fascinating discussion going on in Christian theology, and I'm sure in other theological communities too, about animism, the idea that there's anima or soul or spirit in all of creation. And I think that is it's a problematic area to talk about, because for a lot of people, the word spirit has been defined by Greek philosophy to mean non-material. And I think if we can get a different meaning of spirit that isn't divorced from the material, but is a feature of material, I think this will be a big step forward for us. So just as an example, when Grace and I were walking through Sequoia National Park, she said, it just feels like the trees are talking to us. Now, they aren't speaking English. But for her to say that, she has a sense that there's other kinds of talking. And the bark is telling something to us, and the scent of the needles is telling something to us, and the kind of duff that they create around the base of the tree is telling something to us, and the size is telling something to us. And in some way, we may have a capacity to understand the life message that's coming to us. And we don't need to say it's human language, but it's tree language. And do we have the capacity? Look, we understand this with dogs. If you own a dog, you know what your dog is saying to you by different movements of its body or different tones of its yelp. We find a common language to communicate. Do any of you, I recommend this if you are on Instagram. Look up octopus. And there are all these people who keep octopuses and octopi and show their interactions and are getting to learn their intelligence. And you realize they're speaking through their changes in color and their pulsing of water. And so what would happen if in the next several hundred years, part of human literacy is to develop a literacy for the speech and the communication of nature and of the wind and of the seasons and all the rest. Yeah.
And can you find this in the Bible?
Yes, you can.
Yeah. Who is this?
Yes, you can.
Let's
find
hear
it
it.
in the Bible.
Let's hear it. Speak some. Where are you? Oh, there you
I'm
go.
right here.
Speak about that, please.
I'm really not going to speak about that directly, but because there's a lot of that in the Bible. The neshama, the speaking of the stones, the speaking of the trees. But Robin Wall Kimmerer, who many of you are aware of, wrote Braiding Sweetgrass, and her whole thing is, it could be here, all of the words we've been talking about here, about relationship, about reciprocity, about it's not just about recycling or a revolution.
Right.
It's about relationship.
Right.
And my name is Deborah Wexler. I am a member of Bethlehem Congregation, the only Jewish congregation in Danville. I'm also chair of the Interfaith of the San Ramon Valley Earth Fest, which is coming up on May 4th at St. Timothy's. I hope all of you will come. The motto of Earth Fest is See Hope, Seed Change. And it just is resonating with a lot of what we're talking about here. I think a very important aspect of this is not just relationship with the earth, but relationship with each other. And we're not going to be able to do it without becoming cognizant of how our varied faiths have really common stewardship, not dominion over the earth. And we believe in this very strongly. So I'm sitting here with some of my Earth Fest committee. Lynn was on it last year.
Right. Hi, Deborah.
Hi, Lynn. So May 4th at St. Timothy's, See Hope, Seed Change. There'll be a lot of tablers there. There'll be a lot of, we even have the photographer from last year here. A lot of places where you might find yourself in community with people who are thinking this way. And now it's just leading to my little question, which is, I feel like this group of people here is quite a bit of a like mind. So we're talking to groups to people here who have already these thoughts and these beliefs. And the question is for you, the more we other people, the less we communicate. And the people we're thinking about who are other, what is our conversation? What are the things we can say to people who aren't already thinking like us? How do we speak to the people we think of as other and have them join in this community?
Yes. Oh, thank you so much. Your first name again?
Deborah.
What is it?
Deborah.
Deborah. Thank you. Deborah, thank you so much. And can I just say, May 4th is my birthday, so if you want to give me a present, go be there that day. God would make me super, super happy. That's so great. Deborah, I wish I had an easy answer on this. I have a lot of experience and a lot of failure. So I want to say something about the failure, and then I'll tell you what I try to do and what I see other people trying to do that I think is good, but there's still a lot of failure. So the thing I want to say is, people don't change their minds as individuals. They're part of groups. And if the people in their group see things a certain way, and in their mind you present an idea to see it in a different way, they think, if I accept that idea, my group will kick me out or think less of me. Does that make sense, everybody? So I think what we have to realize is, and this is why your comment about othering is so important, if people are in a group and to change their mind would mean they'd lose belonging and acceptance and respect in that group, it's very hard for them to do it unless there is another group that is ready to receive them and compensate. Let's say they lose 30% of their status and welcome and appreciation in this group. If there's another group that can give them 40% more, then it feels like, oh, good, I can survive and go through this change. Does that make sense? It's not just an idea in one person's mind. That person is part of a network. So what I recommend that we do is, I'll give you two specific ideas that could be useful. One is, when you hear someone say something you think is harmful and wrong, don't be quiet and don't tell them they're stupid. Because they're saying what people in their group think. They think they're right. They wouldn't say it if they didn't think they're right. So what I recommend you do, it really helps with this if you're bald. If you're not, you can still do it. But for me, I go like this. Wow, I see that differently. It's 5 words. Wow, I see that differently. You want to all try it? Wow, I see that differently. Now, I chose those words carefully because wow is a way of saying, I have a lot of emotion about this, but I don't want to yell. I, not you, see that differently. I call this the courage to differ graciously. Now, when you say, wow, I see that differently, people almost always say, well, what do you mean? And if there are a number of people present, be aware that if you disagree with them in public, they will take that as being humiliated, and they'll need to perform their superiority in front of other people. At that point, it will be their ego against your ego, and normally when you put ego against ego, there's not much movement. So what I recommend is when it's possible and appropriate, they say, well, what do you mean? You say, look, I don't need to go into it right now. I just want you and all of you to know I see that differently. If you'd ever like to ask me how I see it and how I came to see it differently, talk to me in private. Here's my phone number, here's my email address, whatever. We could talk about it in private. Because what you're doing now is you're taking it out of a social setting and you're saying, if you want to know how I came to see it differently, you're setting up a meaningful, positive conversation. Where you go from there, there's a lot we could talk about skills of nonviolent communication and so on that can help us make some progress. But so when people say something harmful, which happens quite a bit, it helps to be able to, wow, or...
I think we all need a class in that one. I do too. We've got 5 more minutes, but we have a question here, and if anyone really has a pressing question, you're going to have to make a lot of noise because you may be the last one. Go ahead, sir.
Hi, my name is Roy. Brian, thank you for this talk, and thank you for your books, which helped me to stay grounded as I made a decision about 6 years ago that evangelicalism did more harm than good, and I started to make an exit and build new community, which has gone really well. I came with the group from Linwood United Methodist Church, about 10 miles south, and our pastor, Jen Murdoch. My question is, as I've been reading over the past 6 years and read books like Jesus and John Wayne and Tim Alberta, Kingdom, Power, Glory, and just this past week, the brand new book, which is God, Lies, and Money by, I'm blanking out, Catherine Stewart. I've wondered how long is it going to be. A lot of people I know still give a pass to evangelicalism, even though they've shifted to nationalism and they're coming after you. They want to control your whole life. When will other people become aware? And I've had a couple of conversations just in the last few weeks with people that are changing that tune, and they're not giving a pass, even in their own families, and they're saying things like, yeah, my daughter and her family are nice people when they want to be, and they recognize that evangelicalism has become like a cult. And one dad even said, my daughter told me she'll take care of me when I get sick and can't. No, she's not going to, because of how they feel and what they're seeing. So do you think, is there going to be a shift, and how does that impact the whole equation in terms of how long the general public is going to go along with having their lives taken over by nationalists?
Yes. I don't know. I represent somebody who changed. I grew up fundamentalist, and I changed. I know an awful lot of people who've changed. I think people can change. But it's very hard when you're part of a group whose social structures are very tight. And if you differ in even a slight way, you go from being an insider to an enemy outsider very quickly. It's a very high cost. And what that means is we need communities who will welcome in people who go through those kinds of changes. And they don't have to be all fixed. people have to know they're accepted the way they are. If they're only in step 1 of a 20-step process, that you won't mock them for the 19 steps they haven't taken. So that would be a message to all of the faith communities here, where people are going through these changes. We've got to help make it, we've got to let them know we really want them, and develop the ability to not pounce on them when they say something that we find, in fact, they say something that we find offensive. We say, wow, I see that differently. And they can come to us and say, well, tell me, and it's all very calm. There's no big fight. It's not an argument. It's a sharing of stories. I think that's possible. I think part of what that gives us the opportunity to do is to, when we're not in conflict, when people say something like, hey, how are you doing? You really want to know? How was your weekend? You really want to know? I'd love to tell you. Well, I went to this thing this weekend. We talked about this and this. To be able to make it natural for us to get out what we're feeling inside. How are you doing? I'm doing okay, but I wake up every day wishing we could have a different relationship with the earth and with each other. You might say, I can't say anything like that. Yes, you can. And you might be surprised. If enough of us do that enough, it might be an on-ramp for other people to become part of a new conversation. And maybe that's a good place to close, because in some ways, we have people in this room who are at all different stages in this process, and now there's a whole lot of people around this valley that are in this process. And can we just make a deal? You look around the room, nobody else has to be perfect. You don't have to agree about everything, but to have some sense we're in this together, that's not a bad place to begin.
We're going to have to close it. Do you want to close this, Sam? Okay.
You have a final word, Lynn?
Say again?
You have a final word?
No, I just want to say thank you. And, I've spent many, many years trying to change culture in another area. It was the safety business. And we got away from checklists. Is this, do you have the right switches and cutoff points, to a changing attitude. You either think it, and once you think it right, everything else will happen.
Amen.
So we've got to change the culture. And I think we have a leader here, and I'm going to talk to your wife to see if she can encourage you to keep going.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, let's thank Lynn and Brian. Oh, so good. Everyone in favor of Brian McLaren, keep going? Yes, okay. Thank you. We're going to allow Brian to make his way over to the Wesley Center, and just want to give you a brief word before we make this transition over to the book signing and networking. Again, a reminder that there's some information tables throughout. Please stop by, ask questions, but also meet one another and continue this conversation. I know that a good number of you know a lot about Brian McLaren. One thing that you may not know is that he's a big fan of K-drama, Korean drama. Yes! And so my respect level went even higher. We do also have in the Wesley Center Rakestraw Bookstore, which is our local bookstore in Danville, and they have some of Brian's books for sale if you need one. Please stop by and be willing to support our local business rather than just clicking Amazon Prime 2-day delivery. Thank you, everyone, for being here. God bless you. And please make your way over to Wesley Center. Thank you. This one is mine.